When Australian readers have a serious problem with what they see in their newspapers, the Press Council is all ears, and that's the way it's been for more than 3 decades. But between Communications Minister Stephen Conroy's branding the complaints mediator a toothless tiger and the independent media inquiry questioning its role and effectiveness as a regulator, change is in the air at the council. Chairman Julian Disney says the press in this country does an important job, but that shouldn't excuse it from scrutiny.
When I read the paper each morning or see it online, every day there are things where you just feel very grateful for what people have written, either because it's very perceptive or it's very courageous, even physically courageous, or it's been very persistent, dogged investigation. Every day you would see that. There are, as I say, every day you feel grateful that or I do, that you've got this sort of service being provided. The challenge is, as with any, one feels the same about doctors. You feel very grateful we've got doctors. You feel, perhaps not all that often, very grateful that we've got good lawyers, good engineers, but in any of those professions, there are weaknesses, and that's what this is about.
The big changes to the Press Council will centre on the digital realm.
I think it's not really accurate to believe that quality is easily identified in the sort of cacophony of material online, and that will get significantly worse just because we'll have more and more of it. And as happens in most occupations and professions, over time you need to have a way of indicating who's serious, who's committing themselves to decent standards.
If a reputation for quality is the carrot of bringing news media into the Australian Press Council fold, then restricting legislative protections for journalists could prove an effective stick.
We do need to recognise that if people are going to be given rights and privileges which are given to them on the assumption that they'll comply with standards that traditional journalists did, if those rights are given to them or are given to journalists as they were, and we now have a broader range of people involved in that, we need to think about whether those people should comply as well. But what we're doing at this stage is canvassing ways in which, firstly, one can encourage serious bloggers to be recognised, and down the track the importance of this in the interests of bloggers and online people will become clearer. I think there's a bit of a head in the sand approach in some of this stuff, of people not realising the extent to which, if there isn't an ability to distinguish between those contributors to the media who are willing to subject themselves to an independent system, if there isn't a willingness to distinguish between them and others, then in future it will be very hard to persuade governments and very hard to persuade individual organisations who control access to their own information to provide access to that information. And it's really very odd to allow, to say that an exemption, and this is the case under the Privacy Act, to say that an exemption is just available to people who sign up to a public set of standards set by an organisation representing media organisations. As the Australian Law Reform Commission said, there should be some requirement that the standards be adequate, and there should be some requirement that they be effectively enforced.
The big publishers in Australia have their own editorial codes of conduct. So does the Journalists' Union, and the Newspaper Publishers Association has its guiding principles. This year, the Press Council began issuing standards to complement its statements of principles and advisory guidelines. The standards are designed to offer a clearer idea of how to act in specific contexts, and they're binding. Professor Disney says he wants to see publishers remain the Press Council's major financiers, but initiatives like the Standards Project are only made possible by external funding.
It's very common for organisations to have a range of funding, and in fact the best way of achieving independence is having a range of funding. Independence from, in this case, the media, independence from government, independence from any individual organisation. The best way of achieving that is a diversity of sources.
At the moment, nearly half the Press Council's funding comes from Australia's biggest publisher.
The reality is, unless the Council has more adequate funding and more secure funding, it can't expect to be regarded as sufficiently independent. That is an absolutely fundamental problem in the minds of most commentators, including many in the media, believe that an organisation which is fully or overwhelmingly funded by the media can't be independent. Now, that's just got to be recognised, that there's that attitude. I'm not sure all do recognise that. But also, there is a degree of naivety, I think, in some quarters about what government funding means. For example, some have canvassed that would mean that the government had members on the council. Now, there's not the slightest prospect of that. It's absolutely clear that the council wouldn't accept it. We've said that quite clearly. It's never been raised as a possibility. There's a degree of naivety perhaps amongst people who are not used to getting some government funding and who don't know the extent to which one can just insist that there are not strings. If there are strings, you don't take the money.
But he's agnostic about calls for the council to develop statutory powers of its own, and the council's submission to the media inquiry has played down the value of the power to fine errant publishers.
We can do a lot on our own, and that's what we were doing, just quietly getting on with strengthening ourselves. Whether there's a need for statutory powers down the track, I don't know. There's certainly an argument both here and in the United Kingdom that there's a need for that. It's not at all uncommon, of course, but I think we can do a lot without them. Whether it's enough, I don't know. It depends on how much we're allowed to get on with strengthening ourselves.